Good evening. President Trump said days ago, if they shoot, we shoot. Tonight, mounting evidence shows there is a deadly crackdown on Iranian protesters.
The city did not sleep that night because sleep belongs to places where order still exists. Tehran crossed that line as flames reflected off concrete and glass, turning familiar intersections into scenes of open defiance. Sirens lost their authority, overwhelmed by the roar of bodies moving with purpose. This was not noise, it was pressure. Every blocked highway multiplied that pressure until the capital itself became a weapon turned inward against the state. The regime's calculations, built on intimidation and fragmentation, collapsed under the weight of unity. When 1.5 million people occupy space at once, fear no longer flows downward. It rebounds upward, suffocating those who relied on it. In those hours, the capital stopped obeying and started advancing, forcing the system into a defensive crouch it was never designed to sustain. Attempts to reassert dominance only accelerated the breakdown. Orders were issued, then ignored or delayed, lost in the fog of a city that had slipped beyond centralized command. Units dispatched to clear streets found no corridors left to maneuver through, no gaps to exploit. Barricades appeared faster than they could be dismantled, built from whatever the city offered: metal, stone, burning debris. The crowd moved like a living organism, adapting instantly, closing ranks when threatened, surging forward when resistance faltered. This adaptability exposed a fatal asymmetry. The state required hierarchy and communication to function. The people required only momentum. Each failed push hardened resolve, transforming hesitation into fury and fury into discipline. The digital blackout intensified the confrontation instead of containing it. Darkness was supposed to isolate neighborhoods to make each pocket of resistance feel alone. Instead, it fused them. Without screens to distract or pacify, attention returned fully to the streets. Word traveled by movement, by sight, by the simple fact of seeing thousands stand their ground. Satellite connections kept the outside world watching, but inside the country, the absence of official signals shattered the illusion of control. Silence from above confirmed what many already sensed. The center was blind. When authority cannot see, it cannot strike precisely, and when it strikes blindly, it accelerates its own collapse. By midnight, the balance had tipped unmistakably. Security forces were no longer shaping events, they were reacting to them. In multiple districts, personnel abandoned posts rather than face encirclement. Equipment meant to project dominance became liabilities, immobilized in narrow streets, stripped of support. The burning of paramilitary infrastructure was not random destruction but targeted neutralization. Each facility taken offline reduced the regime's capacity to project force the following day. The crowd understood this instinctively. Chanting gave way to action, and action followed a logic that mirrored military doctrine without formal command. Control of terrain, denial of movement, isolation of strongpoints. The streets had become a battlefield, and the people were learning faster than the state could adapt. As dawn approached, panic began leaking from the upper levels of power.
In 2009, during the Green Movement, a lot of protesters were arrested and detained in that particular place. They were abused, tortured, in some cases killed.
Threats escalated in tone, invoking catastrophic retaliation and external confrontation. Nuclear posturing entered the discourse, a desperate attempt to shift the battlefield away from streets the regime no longer controlled. Claims of rapid weaponization were floated not as strength but as warning cries, yet these signals failed to intimidate the masses below. Instead, they revealed weakness. A government confident in its grip does not threaten annihilation when faced with unarmed civilians. Such language exposed a leadership cornered by its own citizens, grasping for leverage that no longer resonated where legitimacy had already burned away. International responses hardened the sense of inevitability. Movements of military assets, visible on open radar, cut through propaganda with brutal clarity. These were not symbolic gestures, but preparations that carried weight precisely because they required no speeches. The message was implicit and severe. The margin for massacre was gone. For the security elite, this shifted calculations instantly. Loyalty became a liability. Obedience carried personal risk. Rumors of escape plans and quiet defections spread through corridors once sealed by fear. When those tasked with enforcing order begin planning exits, the structure they serve is already compromised beyond repair. What unfolded in Tehran was not merely an uprising, it was a forced reckoning. Decades of accumulated pressure erupted all at once, stripping away the layers that had insulated power from consequence. The streets became the court where grievances were no longer deferred. Every chant, every barricade, every burning symbol carried the same message. The era of unilateral control had ended. The regime could still inflict harm, but it could no longer restore obedience. That distinction mattered more than any single clash. By the end of those hours, the capital had crossed a threshold from which retreat was impossible, locking the confrontation into a trajectory defined not by reform or negotiation, but by collapse. By the morning light, the consequences of the night were impossible to deny. Smoke hung low over districts that had once been administrative anchors, and the absence of authority was no longer theoretical. Police lines that usually reformed at dawn simply did not return. In several areas, officers stood aside, watching rather than intervening, their silence louder than any slogan. This hesitation marked the most dangerous moment for any authoritarian system, the instant when enforcement decouples from command. Once that bond fractures, fear drains rapidly from the population and concentrates entirely within the ruling core. The streets sensed this shift immediately. What might have been exhaustion turned into renewed aggression because people understood that the machine designed to crush them was stalling. Economic paralysis deepened the rupture with ruthless efficiency. Bazaars that traditionally acted as stabilizers closed their doors, not out of caution but defiance. Oil terminals critical to revenue flows slowed and then stopped as coordinated strikes spread. Tankers bound for Asian markets waited idle, unable to load, transforming internal unrest into an external shock. The national currency plunged further, shredding purchasing power and exposing a liquidity crisis that even repression could not fix. When a state cannot pay its enforcers reliably, loyalty erodes into calculation. Salaries delayed or devalued became another weapon wielded unintentionally by the regime against itself, convincing rank-and-file personnel that the future offered only loss if they remained aligned. Symbols shifted just as violently as material conditions. Flags associated with the state vanished from public space, replaced by imagery rooted in a longer national memory. This was not cosmetic rebellion, but ideological rejection. By hoisting alternative symbols on statues and buildings, protesters were declaring that the legitimacy of the entire post-1979 order had evaporated. Such acts strike deeper than slogans because they rewrite visual reality. Authority depends on constant reinforcement through symbols. Once those symbols are torn down or replaced, the psychological infrastructure collapses alongside the physical. The state could still broadcast decrees, but no one was listening because the imagery of power had already been overwritten in the streets. The regime's inner circle felt this erosion acutely. Reports of internal arguments, emergency meetings, and contradictory directives leaked despite censorship. Some officials pushed for overwhelming force. Others warned that bloodshed would trigger consequences beyond containment. The possibility of foreign intervention loomed not as speculation, but as an operational factor shaping decisions. Aircraft movements and diplomatic signals narrowed the space for brutality, boxing leadership into paralysis. Every hour without decisive action strengthened the opposition's position, yet every option for decisive action carried unacceptable risk. This strategic deadlock was fatal. Systems built on absolute authority cannot survive prolonged indecision, because indecision advertises weakness more effectively than defeat. Regional repercussions intensified the sense of collapse. Networks dependent on Tehran's financial and logistical support began to suffocate as funds dried up and routes closed. The so-called axis of resistance lost its central artery, revealing how dependent it had been on a single hub. Without steady backing, allied groups faced operational paralysis, undermining years of strategic investment. This unraveling did not require external attack. It emerged organically from domestic upheaval. The irony was devastating. A state that had projected power outward for decades found itself unable to secure its own capital, its foreign leverage evaporating alongside internal control. Among the population, fear transformed into a form of grim confidence. People understood that retreat would not restore the old order, only postpone reckoning. The choice narrowed to endurance or annihilation, and endurance proved contagious. Even rumors of foreign mercenaries being considered for deployment backfired, reinforcing the perception that the regime had become an occupying force alien to its own society. Against a mobilized population numbering in the millions, such measures promised only escalation without victory. The streets absorbed this logic intuitively, pressing forward not because success was guaranteed, but because survival demanded it. By the end of that phase, the uprising had achieved something irreversible. It shattered the myth that power flowed in one direction. The capital, once the nerve center of control, had become the epicenter of defiance, exporting instability outward instead of absorbing it. Every subsequent move by the regime would now be reactive, framed by the knowledge that obedience could no longer be assumed. This was no longer a question of protest management or reform. It was a systemic failure unfolding in plain sight, driven by momentum that punishment alone could not reverse. By the time the final calculation surfaced, the illusion of continuity was gone. Power no longer rested in offices or broadcast statements, but in the raw arithmetic of bodies and resolve. 1.5 million people had rewritten the rules simply by refusing to disperse. Command chains that depended on predictability collapsed under the strain of a population acting in unison.
Iran's government's intensifying a crackdown on protests against a severe economic crisis.
Every threat issued from above sounded hollow because it arrived too late, stripped of the credibility that fear once provided. The state could still speak, but its voice no longer carried authority. In that vacuum, certainty shifted decisively to the streets, where the outcome was no longer debated, but enforced through presence. External dynamics sharpened this inevitability. Strategic partners who had relied on Tehran as a pillar suddenly faced cascading losses. Supply chains fractured, corridors closed, and long-standing assumptions dissolved overnight. For Moscow, the disruption severed a critical logistical artery, cutting off access that had sustained operations beyond its borders. For Beijing, the paralysis of oil flows threatened energy security and exposed the fragility of arrangements built on a single authoritarian guarantor. Silence from these capitals was not neutrality, but admission. They could not intervene without risking further instability, and they could not stabilize a system already rejected by its own population. The geopolitical architecture surrounding Iran began to sag under its own weight. Inside the ruling elite, survival instincts eclipsed ideology. Private flights, emergency clearances, and quiet exits signaled a collective loss of faith. Loyalty fractured into individual calculations of risk. When officials prepare escape routes, they concede that the structure they serve is already failing. This internal hemorrhage accelerated collapse faster than any external pressure could have achieved. Each departure weakened the remaining core, amplifying paranoia and mistrust. Orders contradicted one another, strategies shifted hourly, and coherence vanished. What remained was a hollow center, desperately attempting to project strength it no longer possessed. The population read these signs with brutal clarity. Confidence hardened into resolve, and resolve into a refusal to compromise. The uprising no longer framed its demands narrowly. It rejected the entire architecture of rule imposed over decades. Flags, chants, and actions converged into a singular declaration that the old order was finished, regardless of how long it took to dismantle what remained. This clarity neutralized fear because it removed ambiguity. When the objective becomes survival and dignity rather than concession, repression loses its leverage. Violence can kill individuals, but it cannot resurrect legitimacy once it has been publicly buried. International military signaling closed the remaining options. Visible preparations, unmistakable in scale and intent, drew a final boundary around the regime's behavior. Any attempt at mass bloodshed now carried consequences that extended far beyond domestic control. This constraint mattered not because it promised intervention, but because it eliminated plausible deniability. The leadership understood that escalation would not be contained, and restraint only prolonged humiliation. Trapped between these outcomes, the system froze. In authoritarian structures, paralysis is terminal. Without decisive force or credible reform, the machinery simply grinds itself apart. As the fires dimmed and dawn returned, what emerged was not calm but clarity. The blackout, the threats, the symbols of power, all had failed to restore obedience. The darkness imposed by the state did not extinguish resistance. It illuminated the regime's own emptiness. What collapsed in Tehran was not only administrative control, but an entire narrative of inevitability. The belief that this system was permanent evaporated in a single night of collective defiance. From that point forward, every moment belonged to those who remained in the streets, because they had already crossed the threshold where retreat offered nothing and persistence promised everything. The uprising did not ebb when the internet died. It intensified. Across Tehran and scores of cities, the regime's blackout meant to smother coordination and hide bloodshed. Only drove the fracture deeper into the heart of Iranian society. Citizens, cut off from text messages and familiar networks, resorted to improvised communication, whispering routes, rally points, and updates from person to person in a relentless chain of human connectivity that no switch could sever. Even with the state's near-total shutdown of digital networks beginning in early January, protesters managed to share scenes of defiance through smuggled satellite links and workarounds that threw back the blackout like a challenge thrown into the darkness itself. What was once a demonstration evolved into a mosaic of ungovernable zones of resistance. In neighborhoods from North Tehran to the industrial districts in the southwest, crowds fortified intersections with debris, overturned buses and scorched tires, signaling that the streets themselves had become the new terrain of power. Local coordination committees sprang up, not as formal leadership but as nerve centers of improvisation, deciding where to march, where to protect civilians, where to block reinforcements. The absence of centralized direction did not dissolve the movement. It accelerated it, because every block was both a unit of resistance and a message that the uprising was contagious and unstoppable. Amid this, casualties skyrocketed far beyond anything the state could easily conceal. Rights organizations reported that the toll from weeks of clashes has surpassed 500 dead and tens of thousands detained, figures that reflect only documented cases amid the regime's information blackout and violent repression. Hospitals, where many wounded were taken, became frontline sites of struggle themselves. Medical staff worked under duress, hiding records, moving the injured quietly, sometimes under threat of arrest. Ordinary families found themselves the carriers of grief and determination, turning funerals into defiance rallies that spread the same message: fear had died in the streets of Iran. The regime responded with escalating brutality. Security forces, backed by remaining elements of the Revolutionary Guard and state militias, opened fire with live ammunition in multiple cities, turning main boulevards into fields of trauma. Reports from the ground recounted lethal engagement in Fardis and elsewhere, where government elements allegedly used heavy machine gun fire against demonstrators. Such tactics were intended to suppress, but instead they fed rage and hardened resolve. Every life taken became a symbol, fueling chants that reverberated far beyond the initial epicenters of protest. Compounding the chaos, the government's rhetoric took a harsher tone. Officials labeled critics as existential enemies, equating street dissent with blasphemy and treason punishable by death. This not only inflamed public sentiment but also revealed how cornered the authorities had become, reliant on fear of punishment when all other legitimacy had eroded. In such a context, the state's willingness to execute its own citizens for dissent reflected not strength but desperation at the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, assaults were reported not just in Tehran but in more than 100 cities and towns across Iran, making the unrest one of the most geographically expansive in decades. Public spaces that once bore the weight of routine life,
we and you can make Iran great again.
Marketplaces, squares, transit hubs, transformed into symbols of defiance, decorated with slogans calling for freedom, justice, and an end to theocratic rule. Even Tehran's historic bazaar, long a heartbeat of commerce and tradition, echoed with silence where once merchants traded, the empty stalls testifying to a protest that struck not only at governance but at daily survival. The demands also crystallized far beyond economics. In many quarters, protesters no longer spoke merely of survival. They declared their intent to redefine Iran itself. Young and middle-class Iranians, pushed into precarity by years of economic decline and exclusion, stood shoulder to shoulder with workers and elders who had tasted hardship for decades, creating an alliance unprecedented in recent memory. This was not a moment of spontaneous chaos, but an eruption of sustained grievance, combining immediate survival needs with a political consciousness that had been fermenting for years. International reactions added another layer of pressure. Foreign governments and human rights bodies condemned the violence and the blackout, mounting diplomatic pressure that pushed Tehran into a defensive posture. Warnings from abroad, including threats that violent mass killings of civilians would trigger severe repercussions, unnerved the regime, narrowing its tactical options. The presence of these external signals did not sway the protesters' appetite for change, but it did expose the regime to strategic vulnerability. The world was not watching passively. and the cost of internal terror was now counted in diplomatic isolation and escalating threats. Within Iran, this moment marked a turning point where fear no longer served as an effective brake on public will. Curfews imposed by security forces were flouted. Raids on homes stirred communities into protective solidarity rather than silence. When families witnessed arrests of neighbors or loved ones, they did not retreat. They mobilized. Every detention became a rallying point, every disappearance a catalyst for more determined resistance. The chain reaction was unstoppable because the regime's instruments of fear had been rendered impotent by their own overuse. In the midst of this upheaval, the idea of rule by force alone met its fiercest challenge. Theocracy, once upheld by intricate networks of religious authority, political patronage, and coercive power, started to look brittle. When even conservative factions within the security apparatus hesitated to fire on civilians, when some elements of the army pledged to focus on national interests rather than suppression, the cracks spread from the street into the state's edifice itself. The army's ambiguous posture signaled that the regime's capacity for unified violence was weakening, and that means the streets have become the new locus of authority. Now, each day is marked by a brutal calculus. The more the regime attempts to crush dissent with violence, the more the protest movement expands and hardens. The more protesters push for fundamental change, the more the old structures falter and expose their own fragility. This is not a battle that can be postponed or papered over with concessions, because every concession now carries within it the memory of repression and sacrifice. The aftermath of these confrontations will shape Iran's future, whether through transformation or through further conflict. And the current upheaval has already rewritten the narrative of what is possible when people refuse to bow to fear.